Good afternoon and welcome to Ask Her. I'm Jacqueline Lendsey, Interim President and CEO of the Washington Area Women's Foundation. We are a community-supported foundation that invests in the power of women and girls of color in Washington, D.C. We award grants and advocate alongside our partners for gender and racial justice. Ask Her is the foundation's interview series with women leaders, our partners, community members, and supporters who work tirelessly for women, girls, and gender-expansive people of color. If you hear anything good today, be sure to tweet during our chat using @AskHerSeries, and you can follow us at the Women's Foundation, and that's at the Women's FNDTN. We would like to welcome everyone joining us today, including Ebony Gayton, our American Sign Language interpreter for our webinar. Thank you so much, Ebony, for being with us today. Our special guest is Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw, co-founder and executive director of the AfricanAmerican Policy Forum. Dr. Crenshaw is the founder and executive director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policies at Columbia Law School. She is also the Promise Institute professor at UCLA Law School and the Isidore and Seville Schultzbacher professor at Columbia Law School. She's popularly known for her development of intersectionality, critical race theory, and the @Say Her Name campaign. And she is the host of the podcast Intersectionality Matters. She's also a columnist for the New Republic and the moderator of the widely impactful webinar series Under the Black Light, the intersectional vulnerabilities that the twin pandemics lay bare. She is one of the most cited scholars in legal history and has been recognized as Ms. Magazine's #1 most inspiring feminist, one of the Prospect Magazine's 10 most important thinkers in the world, and even listed in Ebony's Power 100 issue. She's a busy woman, and so I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Crenshaw.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Let's get started with the conversation, Dr. Crenshaw. Can you tell us a little bit about the African-American Policy Forum? How did it come about? And can you tell us more about your work?
Oh, I'm so happy to answer that question, particularly now, because we are in our 25th year. And one of the unknown conditions of the founding of the African-American Policy Forum was another event that we just commemorated last week, the 30th year anniversary of Anita Hill's testimony in the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill hearings. At that hearing, I was one of the people on Anita Hill's legal support team. And during that time, I had just finished an article on the experience of African-American women and women of color more broadly with respect to intimate partner violence, both sexual violence and domestic violence. And one of the things that I was uncovering in doing that work is just how continuous the stereotypes about Black women and our sexuality had been. And my fear in going to Washington, D.C. was that this particular history of intersectional racism was not well understood, was not well integrated into our collective understanding about the circumstances under which Black women had experienced sexual harassment and sexual abuse since we arrived here. And as a consequence, so many of the easy tropes about Black women could conceivably be rolled out. And everything that happened in that hearing actually tracked what my worst fears were. As people who were around at that time know, Anita Hill was accused of erotomania. Her veracity was attacked. The belief that she was sexually voracious and a sexual prude. All of these things came together to undermine her credibility. And the really sad thing about it was that within the African American community, when Anita Hill stepped forward to testify, the support for Clarence Thomas went through the roof. Basically, when he said that this was a high-tech lynching, it told a story to many African Americans that they thought they knew, and she did not have a story that many African Americans knew. So on the day that Clarence Thomas was confirmed, my eventual co-founder and I were sitting on the steps of the Supreme Court across from the Capitol, and we said to each other that this was going to change the rest of our lives, that nothing was going to be the same. And that was true. So our commitment coming out of that was that the tension that was created between the civil rights and racial justice community on one hand, and the feminist and women's community on the other hand, was one that was going to be continuously destructive unless an organization and a set of allies was prepared to fill in that gap, to make the connections between anti-racism and feminism the cornerstone of what we did. So a few years later, we founded the African-American Policy Forum to fill in precisely that gap that led us to, unfortunately, 30 years of the erosion of the civil rights and gender justice infrastructure at the court level.
So take us back to 1989. You coined the term intersectionality to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Obviously, the Anita Hill experience helped you to coin the term, but is that what led you to coin the term?
No, actually. So the Anita Hill engagement actually came after that by a couple years. And by the way, it reminds me that for folks who would like to hear a little bit more about how intersectionality played out in the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill situation, we just released our last episode of Intersectionality Matters, the podcast, and I interview my co-founder and have conversations with Anita Hill looking back. So dialing it back a few more years, when I was a law student, and I don't like to say like when that was, let's just say it was in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was an activist at Harvard Law School. And one of the things that we were agitating for was for the faculty to integrate itself. It was a faculty of 70 people. They had one tenured African American, one tenured woman, and they were kind of done. Right? They didn't have a sense that the transformations that were taking place across society had any particular implications for an elite institution like Harvard. Now, I was a part of a cohort of students that considered ourselves the next wave of the justice movement. We were the ones who were kind of watching the civil rights movement on TV as kids, waiting to get involved and do our part and carry the torch around racial justice. And so when we got to law school, we were looking to learn the skills and be exposed to the information that we knew that we needed to be of service to our communities. The law school had a different idea. Their idea was that we were on an elevator ride to the top of whatever it is that they typically train students to do, generally go into Wall Street, corporate America, and apply their trade there. So the coursework was designed to prepare students for that work. So the few of us who came there to study with Derek Bell, who had left just a few months before we got there, approached our dean. Our dean, was not receptive to the idea that we wanted to have Derek Bell's courses taught, and we wanted them to recruit more women and more people of color to the faculty. So that was the beginning of a huge long-term controversy and struggle, which is part of the longer story of critical race theory. The story of intersectionality is a story within that story. And the short of it is that when the faculty did decide that they were going to move to try to recruit women and people of color, they came up with a search committee that looked at women and a search committee that looked at people of color. And not too surprisingly, the search committee that looked at women didn't come up with any candidates of color. And the search committee that was looking at candidates of color wasn't really focused on women of color. For me, that was such a institutionalized way of erasing the unique barriers that women of color face. It was shocking to me that a legal institution wouldn't understand that structuring equity policies in this mutually exclusive way was going to continue to exclude women of color. So when I graduated, I wanted to understand more about it. I wanted to see whether it was unique to Harvard or it was embedded in the law. So I went to get another degree and started reading cases about Black women who were claiming that they were discriminated against as Black women. And shockingly, when they made these cases, made these claims, courts just didn't know what to do with the argument. They just didn't understand how a employer that claimed that it was not discriminating on the basis of race because it hired Black people, it just hired Black people who were men, and claiming that they didn't practice gender discrimination because they did hire women, but they hired women who were white, could be accused of discriminating against Black women. So in their view, if you don't discriminate on race or on gender, Black women don't have anything to complain about. And more importantly, the argument was that if we allow Black women to combine their race and their gender into a unique claim of discrimination, that it would open Pandora's box. There'd be no end in sight. And Black women would be getting a preference over everybody else. Black men didn't get a chance to combine their causes of action. White women don't get a chance to combine it. So why should Black women? And what I frankly didn't understand was why it wasn't obvious that, well, Black men didn't have to combine two causes of actions because their story of discrimination was understood by the courts. And the same was happening with white women. So Black women are the only ones that need to combine two causes of action to make their claim legible. Then it's discrimination against them not to let them do it, not preferential treatment. So what I was looking for was a way of making this obvious observation clear to judges, clear to people who obviously needed remedial intervention. They just weren't understanding things that should have been obvious. So I looked around for a metaphorical thinker, and it seemed to me that an intersection nicely captured the experiences that Black women were having. They were being discriminated against as women within the groups of Black people that were hired, and they were discriminated against as Black people within the women who were hired. So they were actually structured exactly, located where the race and gender structure overlap. So if you think of racism as going north to south, and sexism is going east to west, if you think of these as thoroughfares, and the traffic going through those thoroughfares are these policies that say, no, we don't have Black women who work as receptionists and secretaries. That's not what they're for. Or we don't have Black women who work on the floor because that's not what they're for. If you think of those policies running through those thoroughfares, Black women are situated exactly where those policies intersect. And that is the way in which I was trying to use the metaphor to say, it's not that hard to figure this out. Just think about an intersection. Now, the last thing I'll say about it is that, there's Intersectionality 101. What happens when Black women exist in an intersection between racism and sexism and experience policies that marginalize them? But the second level is the failure of anti-discrimination law and the failure of anti-racism and feminism to show up for them. So we had a little slide earlier where you saw these ambulances at the scene of the accident. If you think about one of those ambulances as anti-racism and another one as feminism, the tendency had been prior to that moment, if there is an accident in the intersection and the ambulances can't figure out, well, was it solely caused by race or solely caused by gender, they would just back away and leave. What I was trying to do is to say, this is your business, racism. This is your business, sexism. And therefore, anti-racism and feminism need to stay and attend to the problem that the woman has experienced in the intersection. So that's Intersectionality 101 and Intersectionality 201. I started with Black women because that was where my questions were, but women of color, people with disabilities, queer people, gender expansive people, they often experience discriminations, not singularly, but in conjunction with other disadvantages. And intersectionality just says, we can't be about doing social justice if we don't include all of the risks and all of the consequences of being embedded in systems in which multiple discriminations are often happening at the same time.
Wow. So intersectionality then, in a sense, has gone viral since you coined the phrase back in 1989. It's gone viral in this past half decade, and even in the last couple of years, and even been politicized. And that seems to be the same for your term, critical race theory. In our own work at the Women's Foundation, we updated our mission and our work over the past few years to account for intersectionality, but that shift has not been without some public contention. Why do you think that is?
Oh, well, power never gives up easily. It just never has. So there's nothing unusual about the fact that once a concept or a term or a set of narratives or buried histories are revealed, and their implications about whether the contemporary social terrain is actually fair and legitimate and just, those ideas are going to be subject to critique and controversy, particularly from those who have a zero-sum view about our current social order. So it's not surprising at all that some of the first significant critics that tried to take intersectionality and turn it around as discrimination against white straight men were white straight men. Oddly enough, they were actually using intersectionality as a way of articulating their grievance against intersectionality. So, the point of really their critique obviously wasn't against the idea that one's race, gender, class, or sexual identity actually is meaningful when it comes together. What they were opposed to is meaningful to do what? So for them, they were using intersectionality to repudiate an entire social justice agenda and sustain power and dominance in the hands of a few. I would say reason why there is so much now distortion is that the conditions of that possibility of the distortion have come from, I think, premature enthusiasm with some advances that happened in society and leading people to proclaim that we were post-feminist, we're post-racial. We've seen the promised land and we are here. So we've gone through a period of about a decade of proclamations that if there are inequalities in society, it's not because opportunity is structured in fairly predictable ways. And if opportunity is not the problem, if structural inequality is not the problem, then intersectionality doesn't have any purchase, because intersectionality is basically saying, if you get structural racial inequality, you get the way gender is structured in an economically marginalized way, if you get the way that economic marginality is structured and reproduced, then you should get intersectionality, because intersectionality is just building into all those structures the overlapping recognition that if you're disadvantaged in one sphere, and another sphere, those disadvantages are probably going to be compounded. When we don't have the capacity to talk about structural inequality, then intersectionality goes by the wayside as well. So in trying to understand this moment and moving our way through it, we do have to understand that this is historical. At every period in time where there's been a major advance in social justice, there's been a backlash. It's been called different things. It was called redemption and reconstruction. It was called the moral majority during the silent majority during Nixon era. It was called different things in the 80s. Now it's called the attack on critical race theory and the attack on intersectionality. But it shouldn't be a mystery to us. Retrenchment is just as predictable as, October brings another, Halloween sequel. It is, that villain that we can never fully put down, and we should just be prepared for it when it raises its ugly head again, as it is doing right now.
Well, that brings up a question around critical race theory. You've been quoted as saying that critical race theory has been weaponized. Why do you think so many people are so upset about critical race theory, and why weaponizing the word?
Well, I think we have to take those who are doing the weaponizing at their word. There's really, no mystery, at least the mystery that the media try to create is not an open question. The purveyors of this myth of critical race theory as the new moral panic have said quite clearly that they were looking for a container, something to use and project as the villain, the set of mysterious ideas that can be a container for the grievances and the insecurities that have been produced both by the panic over the increasing multicultural demographic changes in the United States, the insecurity about loss of real income, the insecurity about lack of cultural dominance, and the insecurities caused by global developments, including, of course, COVID. So you've got this mix of very hostile ideas. And they were looking for something to attach themselves to, particularly after the reckoning around George Floyd. Now, people aren't going to be able to say we support police murder. They're not going to say we agree that discrimination is a good thing. They're not going to say, at least not all of them are going to say we are white supremacists. They're not going to say we are nationalists, but they are going to be able to say we're against this thing called critical race theory, even though we don't know what it is. It just sounds bad. And so to this framework were efforts, resourced, highly organized, some dark money efforts to weaponize critical race theory. And if you have any doubt about when they decided, okay, this is the ticket, Just look at the fact that critical race theory was barely mentioned for 30 years. No one said a word about critical race theory. And then when it was discovered as the thing, in one period of time alone, 1,900 mentions of critical race theory on Fox News alone. So this is not unprecedented. We've had a period of time in American history in which McCarthyism told everybody that the thing that they needed to be afraid of was communism. And then they used that to dump everybody into that box, from Martin Luther King to labor and unions to even feminists who were making arguments about the need for there to be ways that women can get out of the home. All of these ideas have been framed as an un-American threat to our way of life. Our problem is that, number one, we don't teach those stories. We don't talk about how many times democratic initiatives were destroyed by just this kind of manufactured moral panic. We don't talk about where we might have been had organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy not effectively won the Civil War by telling the story of Reconstruction as an assault on their rights, as opposed to a realization of freedom and equity for everybody. We don't tell the story about how the Civil Rights Movement was brought to a premature close by creating a moral panic around reverse discrimination. So this is an old page out of a playbook. It's just got a new name written on it. And that new name is designed to make sure that the next generation doesn't know what was done in this generation to disrupt all of the amazing energies that had been created by the George Floyd reckoning last year.
You know, that brings up another question in terms of your work. You talk about the attempt to demolish racial hierarchies altogether. And that brings us to the Black Lives Matter movement and picking up steam last year, increased gender violence and the continued disappearance of Black and Indigenous women. What challenges have you faced during the pandemic?
Well, our main challenge was to continue doing the kind of work that we were doing, holding space, especially holding space for families of Black women who were killed by the police. We started Say Her Name in 2014, during the time that so much energy was surging in the streets of America over the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice. And we were part of that. We were in the streets, we were marching, we were, chanting, we're shutting it down for Mike Brown. We were part of that, that surge in demands for accountability and justice. And at the same time, we were witnesses to the fact that so many of the women who were being killed, Black women who were being killed by sometimes the same police department. Tanisha Anderson was killed about 10 days before Tamir Rice was killed by the same Cleveland Police Department. She was killed when her family called the police 911 for a mental health call. She was not under the arrest. She was not suspected of any wrongdoing. She simply did not want to go with the police officers, and they did a takedown move on her and held her on the ground until she expired, holding a gun on her family, preventing them from coming to provide assistance. The trauma that was caused by that family, knowing that they called the police to help and the police came and took their daughter's life. Those kind of stories weren't being told. People had no idea that Black women were also being killed by the police, girls as young as 7 and Black women as old as 93. So we've been holding space for Black families of women who were killed by the police, recognizing that many of them had no idea that they were not alone. They had no idea because their names weren't known, they weren't being spoken, and the losses were not being lifted up. So one of our challenges during the pandemic was maintaining that momentum, just providing opportunities for these families to come together and to touch and heal each other in a way that nobody else could. No one knows what it's like to lose a daughter to the police, to be raising grandchildren, and to be doing so when nobody knows that this has happened, or those who do know that it was happened adopt a kind of parallel to rape culture, basically saying, well, if a woman got killed by the police, and she must have been doing something, or she must have been with someone she shouldn't have been with, she should have been home with her kids. The blame has been remarkable. Our solution, to the extent that there was one, and I'll just broaden it to say, we were seeing intersectional vulnerabilities play out across the board with COVID. We were seeing women of color being disproportionately framed as essential workers, but also as disposable workers. We were seeing women of color many times being the sole breadwinner, being the ones who were responsible and consequently put in a position of destitution, and out of destitution comes so many kinds of circumstances that put Black women and other women of color at risk. And not surprisingly, we found that the FBI last year recorded that 4 Black women on average were killed each day. That's a Black woman being killed every 6 hours. A tremendous jump in homicide, particularly facing Black women. So we tried to use these opportunities, this new virtual space, to gather people together to understand the twin pandemics of COVID and violence through an intersectional lens. So we tried to use intersectionality to explain why these outcomes were predictable, and use these outcomes as a way of explaining to people what intersectionality actually is. So now we have both Under the Black Light, in which we've had 30 episodes in which we bring and curate a community together to understand everything ranging from COVID now to the health disparities that have been written off by those who want to attack talking about disparity as a racial injustice, which is obscene that this is happening during a time that so many people are dying from COVID, to police accountability, sexual violence, economic marginality, and a whole range of other issues. So we've been using this space to try to take the work to the next level.
Well, that brings me back to the term intersectionality and even critical race theory. What do you wish you knew back when you coined the term that you know now?
To trademark. When you're an academic and an activist, the main objective is to provide tools to help us do our work better. I often say that you cannot solve a problem that you cannot name. You cannot name a problem that people are unwilling to attend to. So my work as an activist has been to generate the need to attend to the missing dimensions of anti-racism, the missing dimensions of feminism and all of our social justice frameworks, so that we are better prepared to be better allies. We're better prepared to do the full work of what feminism requires, the full work of what all of these agendas demand of us. So in that environment, one wants these ideas to travel widely. One wants people to be exposed to the framework, because the framework is like a prism. It's like a pair of glasses. It allows you to see things that are right in front of you, but you didn't have the available refraction to be able to see it more clearly. So that is the desire. The challenge is, in a time like this, when most people now who have heard of some of these frameworks have heard about it from those who are committed to distortion, who are committed to misrepresentation, who are committed to the big lie. This lie about racial justice, this lie about what's happening in school systems, this lie about un-American ideas is as much a part of the big lie as January 6th was. The problem is that it's easier for people to see January 6th as a lie, at least people in our community, than it is for people to see the need to sustain and support the frameworks that allow us to understand the consequences of these lies and where they came from. So even before January 6th, even before the big meltdown, my concern had been that intersectionality, critical race theory were not frameworks that people were supporting and investing, and by people I mean philanthropic communities, nearly at the same level that those who are attacking the ideas were supporting the institutions that were taking it down. So if we just look across the terrain now, there are a few mainstream think tanks and organizations that are behind the COVID lies, that are behind the election, and that are behind the lies about critical race theory. They have huge budgets, multiple organizations, and a lot of the money is dark money. So our side has basically thought that a good idea will rise to the top, a bad idea will not. That was pre-social media, pre-Proud Boys, pre-everything. Now we have to realize that ideas don't rise or fall on whether they are accurate or they're good, no more than the truth rises or falls on what is true and what's a lie. So at this point, it's really vital for us to rethink our belief that naturally people will understand the need for social justice. Naturally, people will support democratic institutions. Naturally, people will hold folks accountable who have attacked our democracy, who are attacking voting, who are attacking protest. That is just not what's happening. So our question is, when we start coming up with agendas to support women and girls, to support people of color, are we doing what we need to do to support the frameworks and ideas that allow our constituencies to actually articulate what the injustices are that they are fighting against?
Well, I want to give our participants an opportunity to ask a few questions, but I've got two questions that I want to put together because I think they come together in all that you've just said. We at the Women's Foundation are working on a national initiative with 8 other women's foundations, the Young Women's Initiative, and it's around particularly young women of color. We want them to lead, to prosper economically, to live safe and healthy lives. And considering that that's our focus, one, the other being that as a women's foundation here in this region, we work with organizations who are also working on improving the lives of young women and young girls of color. So 2 questions, but I think they could have the same, perhaps the same answer. 1, what advice would you give to young women and young girls as they become change agents in their communities? And what advice would you give to organizations like the Women's Foundation who are focused on supporting those women and girls in their communities?
Well, I so appreciate you're asking that question, and I want to answer it by basically historicizing some part of this work, actually. Uh, During the latter years of my brother's keeper, several of us who then went on to do some of this work on girls of color were quite frustrated about the fact that when it came to talking about racial injustices, who was being left behind, the conversation was rarely a conversation that focused on girls and women. The framework was basically one understandably derived from the crises over Trayvon Martin and the sense that Black boys in particular were having a particularly hard time, which was the frame of the time. But the reality was that girls of color, Black girls, Indigenous girls especially, were also having a particularly tough time. It was just that the measurements and the metrics that shaped the life chances for girls weren't part of the definition of the problem in the first place. So that created a path-dependent circular process of exclusion. As it turned out, we take up the school to prison pipeline, for example, Black girls had greater disparities related to white girls being expelled and suspended than Black boys did with respect to white boys. But the conversation, because it started off just being gender exclusive, really had a difficult time making it over to, you know what, our girls are being discriminated against and the consequences for them are lifelong. You know, once you're suspended, the chances of you graduating lessen, the chances of you having a job that allows you to support yourself and your family is reduced. In fact, the consequences for not having a high school diploma are greater for women and girls than they are for men and boys. And we did not know this. So one of our objectives was to provide spaces for it to be known what is happening to women and girls of color. So that became our town hall series. We did 15 of them from 2013 to last year. And that work has now been amplified by many of the our partners in that work, by many of the foundations, which means that something small can actually grow into a presence. But it also means that we can't maintain the same path dependency that excluded girls of color when the focus was on boys. We have to remember that it's the disadvantages go across the life cycle. So in the same way that girls are disadvantaged relative to white girls, so obviously are childbearing age Black women disadvantaged, but also so are women as they age. And one of the most riskiest factors leading to economic marginality and homelessness is for Black women over the age of 50. So I'm excited about the work that we're all doing with girls. I think it's very important, but we also have to clear the path for them as they age. And we also have to remember how many of us are still here and recognize that there have to be targeted interventions across the life cycle.
You know, thank you so much, Dr. Crenshaw, for that, especially for the thoughts about our organizations and others working for women and girls, but also considering the fact that we are living longer and more of us are reaching that age of over 50 with similar issues. It's time now for our audience to ask you questions. So Mercy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure thing. So we have a question from social media. It sounds like you're doing a lot of work. What has self-care looked like for you over the past 18 months?
You know, this is the question, and one would think that I had an excellent answer for that. And I am part of that generation that we haven't come up with the gender equivalent to John Henry, but there is one where we just work until we can't anymore. And I recognize both the orientation and the consequences of that. So part of the self-care is reminding myself that it is a thing. And I need to be more mindful of that. I can say that if there's any silver lining about COVID, is that in this new ability to interact with multiple communities without actually the wear and the tear of travel. The best thing has been I haven't gone anywhere. I've basically been 3 places in the last 2 years, and that has been a game changer for me. So that's been a very important thing, and that has, of course, given me more time to take care of my physical self and my mental self. It's easy to overload though, even though we now have this, platform. So reminding myself not to recreate what the world looked like before we just got a chance to sit down on Zoom and talk to people that we've been wanting to talk to. So trying to keep that balance has been my new challenge in my self-care strategy.
Wonderful. We have a comment here from Michelle Cole that says, amen, amen to that observation, Dr. Crenshaw. Good for you. Keep practicing radical self-care. Another question we have here is about philanthropy in the nonprofit sector. From your point of view, how do you see it changing as the pandemic continues?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say there were signs that things were changing dramatically this time last year. And I would say it wasn't simply the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but the violence pandemic. It's almost hard to remember how much enthusiasm there was, how much conversation there was about, is this a moment or a movement? How many institutions were promoting the idea of Black Lives Matter, how many characters who hadn't shown up were showing up, how the conversation was moving from a bad apple and racism is about prejudice to it's really not about bad apples, it's about structures, it's about policies and practices. It's about implicit biases as much as it is about explicit ones. So it seemed as though things were really off and we were going through a portal. And then we had the backlash, and now we're having numbers come out that show that there was an uptick. But we're still looking at single digits when we're talking about foundation support for racial justice, and even fewer when we're talking about foundation support for women and girls of color. So I think the challenge is how much can we keep that ethos moving and active to say it's great that these commitments were formally articulated, but let's take a hard, cold, long look at what dollars have been opened up. How has the foundation world actually shifted? And I would say that one of the important pieces of that conversation might involve a deeper historical dive into how the foundation, how the philanthropic community has shaped the contemporary terrain of how racial justice has been understood or misunderstood, or how gender justice has been misunderstood, and the silos that have, sustained itself. So I still think that this is a moment full of possibilities. And at the same time, we have to have some sharper, elbows to keep people from shutting the door on this moment, and making sure that the motivation is followed with not just more dollars, but more willingness to sit with and self-interrogate how the foundation world has consistently been a part of much of what we are trying to dismantle.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We have another question here related to the Washington region. How can local DC, Maryland, and Virginia people, supporters, organizations engage with the AfricanAmerican Policy Forum or your local partners?
Oh, that's wonderful. So a couple of things right off the bat. We are desperately trying to reach beyond the media to connect with parents and teachers and community members to help people understand that this attack on racial justice, this attack on history, this attack on critical race theory is something that everyone who is committed to passing on the torch to continued advances in social justice needs to be concerned about. We have what we call a Truth Be Told campaign on our website, aapf.org, where we have short videos so people can understand and have this demystified for them. Also to share their stories. I think a lot of people may not have been following how radical some of these attacks are on school teachers, on administrators, and what the risk is for a potential bloodbath in terms of firing teachers, firing administrators after such a long, hard slog. We have had teachers who've been fired for teaching Ta-Nehisi Coates. We've had parents who've demanded that the bluest eye, Toni Morrison, be taken out of the curriculum. We've had people say that Ruby Bridges' autobiography, the Black girl who integrated public schools, was racist and made white students feel bad. You couldn't make this stuff up. Yet this is happening across the country, and it's being framed as an effort to make no student feel bad. Well, how about the ways that our children are made to feel bad when our histories aren't told? What about the ways in which the inequalities that we still inherit and pass on are framed as just there, or just a product of who we are or our culture, without the historicizing of why our society looks the way it does? It leads to the inference that it's something wrong with Black children and brown children and Indigenous children. So the challenge is for us to tell the stories about what education does when it doesn't tell these stories, how it harms. What does education that does tell these stories actually do? What does it enable? What does it create? And I think we all have these stories. We all know when something went wrong in our schooling, and we all knew what that teacher was that turned us on and lit a fire under us. We need to be telling those stories. And so we're trying to collect that information and make people understand what's at stake. I try to get people to understand critical race theory is nothing mysterious. It's not big theory. It's basically just the mother wit of people of color who've lived lives in a society that is not equitable. So my shorthand version is, every time you're driving a car, if you are a person of color and you see a siren in your rearview mirror, when you pull over slowly and talk very, very politely and keep your hands on the steering wheel, you are practicing critical race theory. You are critical of the recognition that race still counts, and that shapes what you think may happen in this interaction. We just need to get that word out to so many people so that they're not afraid. And lastly, support the mothers of Say Her Name. So many of you may know that 3 weeks ago, we released a single with Janelle Monáe and Beyonce and Alicia Keys. I couldn't believe it, but it is raising awareness about what is happening at the intersections of violence against women and anti-Black police violence. This is the kind of work that we do. It's conceptual. It's bringing people to see the things that are in front of them and activating them. So using our assets and spreading the word, bringing people to our podcasts and our webinars, all of this is the kind of work that helps spread the footprint and enable people to fight for the kinds of social justice frameworks that allow for transformation to be real and possible.
I know there are several more questions that people want to ask, but it looks like we're running out of time and we're almost over time. So I'm going to have to end our conversation here. We're so grateful to have this time with you today. It's so needed for all our work, especially those of us who are centering our work on intersectional feminism. Please stay in touch with the Women's Foundation and visit our website, thewomensfoundation.org. If you've enjoyed your time with us today, consider donating in support of the Women's Foundation at thewomensfoundation.org/give. Please join us for our next Ask Her interview on November 18th, where we'll discuss the safety of Native American women and girls with Shannon O'Loughlin, Chief Executive and Attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs. Dr. Crenshaw, thank you so much for championing liberation, for championing joy, for championing self-care, for championing gender justice. Where can people engage with you and the AAPF?
Love that. They can follow us at AA Policy Forum on Twitter and Instagram. They can follow me at Sandy Locks on Twitter and Kimberlé Crenshaw on Instagram, and they can go to our website, www.aapf.org. There you can find a wealth of materials, sign up for our newsletter and get early information about upcoming events and extra material from our Intersectionality Matters podcast.
Thank you again, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. This has been an amazing and much needed conversation. I think we all are walking away with a clear understanding of intersectionality, critical race theory, and the work that you and AAPF are doing on our behalf, on the behalf of women of color and girls of color, all people of color around this country and even across the world. So thank you so much, Dr. Crenshaw, for being with us today. And thanks to everyone who's attended the session.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.